The cell door opened abruptly. Men in armor entered and shouted. One of them pointed a torch into the corner of the room, and the light fell on a figure huddled against the wall. The princess cowered, her sleeves torn, and traces of blood on her left arm. The knight standing nearby stepped between the guards and her, stretched out his hand and said, "Stop." The guard commander stepped forward and pointed his finger at her chest. "This is treason. We caught her in the act." The princess looked at the knight. She whispered, "Save me." The knight did not answer. The guards took her by the arms. One of them threw a rope over her and led her down the stairs. The knight walked behind, his fingers clenched into a fist. When the door slammed shut, he bowed his head and whispered, "I'm sorry." She was placed in the north tower. There, the door was heavy, the locks deep, and the window a small slit. She was left in a simple shirt and without jewelry. People whispered about her. Rumors spread throughout the palace, but the king remained silent. A few days later, a knight was brought to the tower to be her guard. His name was Thomas. He was young, but there was a lot of determination in his eyes. He entered the cell, rearranged the bowl of bread, and said, "I am Thomas. I am your guard." She replied, "Eliana." He wrote it down in his notebook without asking any questions. For the first few weeks they hardly spoke. Thomas came in the morning and evening, brought food, checked the locks, and left. He was strict. She lay on the straw and counted the footsteps below. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she was silent for days. He did not interfere. Once she asked quietly, "Why do they hate me so much?" He looked at her and said, "People like simple stories. You've become part of a story that's convenient for them to believe." She didn't ask for an explanation. It was important to her that someone had called her by name and hadn't shouted back. A month later, he began to stay longer. He would approach the door and stand there for a while, hesitating to enter. One evening, he sat down on a stool directly opposite her bench and took off his gloves. She took some bread and offered him a piece. He turned away and said, "That's your food." She smiled, and it was almost a laugh. The strawberry stain would remain on his fingers, a small detail that would change their conversation. He noticed how she was holding the piece of bread and asked, "Are you eating well?" She shrugged and replied, "Not really. There's not enough salt." He grunted and put a piece of cheese next to it. They began to talk about simple things. She told him how she played with her younger brother as a child, how she learned to read. He talked about how his father taught him to wield a sword and how his mother sewed raincoats during the cold winters. He didn't try to appear important. He spoke calmly, without pretension. He listened. This was new to her. Someone who listened without subtext. Thomas's gaze was not full of gossip or palace intrigue. He looked like a man who saw a person in front of him. One night, when she heard the footsteps of the guard below, she began to speak first. "Aren't you afraid they'll take you away for this?" he asked. He looked silently at the door, then at her palms. "I swore to protect. I protect," he said. There was no pride in his voice, only duty. She asked, "What if I'm executed?" He turned away and clenched his teeth. "There has been no trial yet," he said, "but I can't sit and watch you die." She asked, "What do you suggest?" He looked at her as if choosing his words. "If you agree, I'll try to help you escape." She closed her eyes and said, "Where should I go? To whom?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "To the forest by the north wall. I know a path there. The guards won't find us there." Her lips trembled. She asked, "Are you sure?" He leaned towards her and squeezed her hand. "I'm not sure of anything except one thing. I won't leave you here if I can help it." They began to prepare quietly. He brought new ropes from the staircase repairs and hid them under a scarf that hung on a hook. She learned to tie knots and hide food in the folds of her shirt. Every gesture was cautious, every word restrained. They spoke quietly, sometimes in whispers, sometimes eye to eye. He taught her to run on stone without making a sound. She taught him how to tie a knot that wouldn't come undone in a hurry. Their relationship was changing. What began as cautious communication became something more. She looked at him often, and in her gaze there was gratitude mixed with another feeling that she could not easily name. He would linger his fingers on her wrist as he passed by, and her breath would catch. One morning, before the king was to gather for council, rumors spread through the castle that her sentence would be handed down soon. Thomas arrived with a white cord on his belt. He had hidden a sharp knife there. She saw it and asked, "What is that?" He replied curtly, "If necessary, we will cut the ropes." Her eyes widened. She whispered, "You know it's dangerous. You'll be executed if you're caught." He stood and looked at her, and there was something in his gaze that she saw for the first time. Fear for himself and for her at the same time. "I know," he said, "but I'd rather die knowing I tried than live knowing I did nothing." She smiled through her tears and raised her hand to touch his cheek. He did not pull away. She said, "Then let's do it at night, when the guards at the gate are replaced. You will lead me out, and I will follow you." They agreed on a time. They talked about trivial things to distract themselves from thoughts of possible execution, about bread, about cheese, about funny things people said in the palace. These simple conversations were their hope. Every evening they lay down holding each other's hands. He would sometimes whisper, "Hang in there," and she would reply, "I'm hanging in there." They both knew that tomorrow could be a new day of freedom or the last day of their lives. They listened silently to the footsteps on the stairs as her eyes closed. When he left behind the smell of iron and parchment. She closed her eyes and imagined them walking along the path by the north wall, passing through the gate and disappearing into the night. She imagined them laughing. She knew she was thinking not about choice, but about the next step. He arrived at the appointed hour and closed the door behind him so that the sound would not reach the stairs. The only sound that could be heard clearly was the creaking of the floorboards under his boots. She sat on the bench and waited. In her hands was the handkerchief he had placed under her pillow. He put a bag of bread and cheese at her feet, then handed her the key. She sighed and said quietly, "Are you sure this will work?" He looked at her calmly and replied, "It's better to take a small risk than to wait for death." She nodded. He walked over to the lock and checked it from the outside. "It's an old mechanism," he whispered. "I know how to bypass it. But when the door opens, we have to move quickly. No one must hear us." She stood up and adjusted her shirt. She looked at him and said, "If we get into trouble, don't leave me." He silently took her hand and squeezed it. "I won't," he said. They went down into the corridor. Thomas went first. She followed behind him, holding his shoulder. He stopped at the first staircase and listened. Nothing. He walked on, touched the door, bypassed the lock mechanism, and carefully moving the bolt, heard a soft click. The door opened. He whispered, "Go." She stepped onto the stone, her footsteps quiet, as if she had learned to walk in silence. Beyond the gate, a dark courtyard awaited them. He pointed to the side of the courtyard where the shadows were deeper. They ran. In the darkness, everything was familiar, and yet unfamiliar. Every creak, every voice could mean the end. They ran along a narrow path, Thomas leading the way, showing her the way behind the wall. She could see his back, how he kept his hand on the hilt of his knife, how his shoulders were tense. She followed him, thinking only of how important it was to breathe. With every step, her heart beat faster. They reached the gate. He checked the guard at the gate and saw that the shift was small. He gave a signal, and one of the guards was distracted by the horses. Thomas took the princess aside and, slipping past, directed her to the north wall. The further they walked from the castle, the more it seemed to her that she could hear every sound. But the footsteps were their own. They crossed the first section of the field and came to a path that Thomas knew. He said, "If we walk quickly, we'll reach the old ravine." She held his hand tightly so as not to get lost. "Don't you think someone might be following us?" she asked. He could see her eyes in the darkness and said, "I do, but I also thought it was better to act." They walked along the path, and at one point they heard a scream. Thomas stopped and put his finger to his lips. They stood and listened. The scream repeated, quieter. Thomas whispered, "Check it out." He walked a little way ahead and returned a minute later. Nothing. Someone was screaming at the other end of the field. He pulled her by the hand and said, "Come on, hurry." She quickened her pace. When they entered the forest, she felt relieved for the first time. It was dark and cramped, but there were no walls or bars. She took a deep breath and said, "I thought I'd never get out." He looked at her and replied quietly, "You will, if we make it to the village by the river." She asked, "Why are you helping me? You could just serve and wait for orders." He stopped and said, "Because I saw how they were leading you. You're not like the ones in the rumors." She looked at him and said, "I'm grateful." He nodded briefly. They walked a few dozen steps into the forest, and at one point Thomas slowed down. He sat down on a stump and said, "Wait here, I'll check the surroundings." She sat down next to him, put her hands on her knees and listened to his footsteps. He returned quickly and said, "All is quiet, but we need to go a little further, and we'll be in a safer place." She wanted to ask how he felt, but the words wouldn't come. Her thoughts were occupied with how the former courtyard was now behind her. They sat by a narrow path and ate bread. Thomas broke the bread and gave her a piece. She took a piece and smiled politely. He looked at her and said, "If you're tired, I'll carry you on my shoulders." She was embarrassed and replied, "I can walk myself." He didn't insist, but then, when the path became steeper, he still supported her by the waist and helped her up. She pressed herself against him briefly, so that no one would notice. They were silent. After a while, they heard the galloping of hooves. Thomas stood up abruptly and pulled her down into the bushes. She fell and covered her face. He put his hand on her head and whispered, "Be quiet." The hooves passed by, the sound receding into the distance. He got up and said, "A horse with a courier, but not ours. They're going in the other direction." She was shaking, but not from the cold. When everything quieted down, she looked at him and said, "You risked more than I did." He lowered his eyes and replied, "I made a choice." They continued on their way. By nightfall, they came to a small hut where an old farmer, an old acquaintance of Thomas, lived. He agreed to hide them for one night and gave them a corner in the barn. When they went inside, Thomas closed the door and said, "We are safe for the night, Tomorrow morning we'll continue on to the river." She lay down on the old straw, and without letting go of his hand said, "Thank you." He sat down beside her and said, "Rest. I'll keep watch." She looked at him and asked, "Aren't you thinking of going back?" He replied quietly, "I have thought about it, but I can't." She sighed and said, "I'm afraid for you." He said, "Be afraid for yourself. I'll be right here." The night passed slowly. They slept in turns, one keeping watch while the other rested. When dawn broke, they got up and prepared to leave. Thomas looked at the princess and said, "We'll go along the river, where the boatman knows the way. He can take us across the water to the road, where no one will ask us any questions." She nodded and took the bag from her back. They went out onto the path and walked away. At that moment, Thomas smiled for the first time all night. She smiled back. They took another step or two when they heard a voice behind them. "Stop!" The light of torches illuminated the path. Men in armor appeared between the trees. Thomas grabbed her hand and pushed her aside, but the men had already surrounded them. He drew his knife, and in that same second, one of the guards rushed forward and struck him on the shoulder with a club. Thomas fell, but managed to shield the princess with his body. She cried out, "Thomas!" He grabbed her and tried to get up, but the guards surrounded them tightly. One of them grabbed her by the hair and pulled her back. Thomas saw the commander's brown face and heard a familiar voice. "Don't think you can escape the king's orders." He held a sharp sword to Thomas's throat. Thomas looked at him and said, "I promised to protect her. I did." The commander laughed and replied, "You have broken your oath." They tied their hands and led them back towards the castle. Thomas tried to resist, but the blows and ropes did their job. She grabbed the sleeve of his cloak and said, "Don't be silent. Tell them it's not true." He looked at her, then at the commander, and said through clenched teeth, "I said everything I could." They walked in silence, and the thought came back to her that all their steps were leading back to the same place they had fled from. They led them back slowly. Thomas was dragged by 2 soldiers, his hands tied behind his back. Eliana was held by the elbow, so she wouldn't stumble. Her dress was stained with dirt, her hair disheveled. She looked at Thomas and whispered, "We could have made it. Why did they go so fast?" He replied with just one word, "Failure." His voice was quiet, but firm. Downstairs at the gate, they were met by the same commander who had held a knife to Thomas's throat. He looked at both of them with a cold smile and said, "The king wishes to see them immediately." In the throne room, the king sat without rising. His face was pale, his eyes narrowed. When Eliana was brought into the room, he did not show that he was struck by her appearance. He looked as if he were counting every fold of her shirt. Thomas stood nearby, his chains jingling with every movement. The commander bowed and said, "We caught them outside the castle. Your orders have been carried out." The king looked at Thomas and said evenly, "You have betrayed your oath, Thomas. You were guarding her. Explain." Thomas looked up. There was no cunning in his gaze. He said bluntly, "I let her out. I wanted to save her." The king exhaled and struck the armrest of the throne with his fist. "Save her?" he repeated. "She is a traitor, and the honor of the family is tarnished. You knew your duty?" Thomas lowered his head, but said, "I saw her. I saw that rumors are not proof." The king whispered, "Proof will be found. The court will decide." Eliana was silent. She looked at her father and tried to say the word "Dad," but no sound came out. She raised her hand, wanting to say that it wasn't true, that she had been falsely accused, but the king interrupted her. "Enough words. The trial will be tomorrow. You, Thomas, will be questioned by the investigator." His voice was firm. The commander took Thomas to a separate torture chamber, a demonstrative measure so that others would understand. Eliana was sent to a higher prison cell. As she was being led away, she saw Thomas being pushed. He did not scream. He did not ask for mercy. His lips moved as if he were saying a prayer to himself. In the cell, she fell onto the same bench and laid her head on her knees. Tears streamed from her eyes, but she did not cry out loud. Her head was spinning. Escape, forest, bread, kiss. She remembered how he had said, "I won't leave you." Now they were both in custody. She was overcome with fear for him, not for herself. She knew that if Thomas was broken, her chances would diminish. She thought, if he confesses under torture, he'll tell them all the details. If he remains silent, they'll break him. But maybe they'll believe he acted alone. In the morning, the investigator arrived. He was a thin man with a neatly trimmed beard. He sat down opposite her and drew up a long list of questions. "Did you love him?" he asked bluntly. Eliana looked at him and replied, "I don't know what love is. I know he helped me." The investigator leaned back and said, "Help is a crime if it violates orders. Are you willing to flee?" She remained silent. He continued, "The evidence is against you." She raised her head and whispered, "Where is the evidence? Who said that?" The investigator spread his arms. "The court is full of eyes, Princess. People hear and see what is convenient for them to see. But the court will not spare you. Think of your father, of your home." She closed her eyes and said, "I did not do what I am accused of." Meanwhile, Thomas was taken to the dungeon, where chains and hunger awaited him. He was beaten at the entrance to show his strength. He did not complain. One of the soldiers said, "He should have been executed immediately." Thomas looked at him and replied, "I do not ask for mercy." Later, a priest was brought to him, and the priest tried to persuade him to confess. Instead of confessing, Thomas said, "I did what I thought was right." The priest bowed silently and left. Thomas lay on the straw and thought about Eliana. He remembered her hands, her face at the door, her quiet, "Save me." He thought about how easy it was to love someone who was close to him. The court was attended by important people, lords, courtiers, several monks, and the king. The commander stood nearby and recounted how he had caught the fugitives. He described the roads, the fire, the chase. His words were calculated. He added, "They were caught in the fields near the north wall. They were outside the castle. Ropes and a knife were found on Thomas." Thomas stood up and said in a voice that everyone could hear, "I took the ropes. I took the knife to help her. I did not want to betray the king, but I could not watch her being led to her death without trying." Whispers spread through the hall. The king stood up and said slowly, "You have broken the law, my son. You have broken your oath. You have betrayed your duty. You have violated the honor of your family." Thomas looked at the king and replied, "I violated my oath because the oath did not see the truth. I saw a man, not rumors. If I must pay for this, I will pay." The king looked at Eliana. "And you?" he asked. "You knew this was a crime." Eliana raised her head, her eyes hardening. "I knew the risk was great. I did not ask for this, nor did I swear to marry others. I asked to live." Silence fell over the hall. The courtiers talked at length. Some saw her as the cause of the disorder, others as a victim of intrigue. Finally, the king stood up and announced the verdict. For treason and dishonor to the family, the punishment is death. Thomas, for betraying his oath, death. The court is the court. His voice was steady. He said, "The execution will take place tomorrow at dawn. Let everyone see that the law is stronger than feelings." Eliana and Thomas exchanged glances. He said quietly, "I heard you." She took his hand through the bars, their fingers intertwined. She said, "I am with you." He nodded and whispered, "I am with you." In the dungeon at night, they spoke quietly. They brought them their last meal and brought a priest to them. The priest prayed, but Thomas asked him not to pray. "Not for me," he said. "For her." Eliana looked into his face and asked, "Are you afraid?" He smiled a tired smile. "I am afraid," he admitted, "but I am more afraid to go on living with the thought that I did nothing." She put her ear to his lips and said, "If tomorrow is the end, let it be together." He sighed and said, "Enough words. Sleep if you can." She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep did not come. She held his hand all night. At dawn, they were led out into the square. The people had gathered. They had come to watch, because they always watch things like this. They were led to a table where the executioner stood. Thomas walked shoulder to shoulder with Eliana, even though his hands were tied. The commander pointed to the crowd and said, "Let this be a lesson." Eliana walked and looked at the crowd. She saw faces she knew, heads bowed submissively, standing firm. Suddenly someone shouted, "Let her be questioned again." But the king gestured for the crowd to be quiet. Thomas looked at Eliana and said, "If you can, look me in the eye when it happens." She held his gaze. He opened his lips as if to say something important, but the words did not come out. They came to the table. The executioner tied them to the post. Eliana heard the ropes rubbing against her skin, heard the commands. When everything was ready, the king stood up and said loudly, "For treason and betrayal, death, so be it." The crowd whispered, some crossed themselves, some turned away. The executioner raised his axe. Thomas smiled slightly. He turned his head towards Eliana and whispered, "Look." She looked at him and saw not fear, but determination. He added, "I have no regrets." She replied, "Neither do I." He reached out to her as far as his bound hands could and touched her lips with his fingers. Then they both bowed their heads and kissed, first quickly, then longer. The kiss was simple, lips touching lips, hands touching hands. It lasted a second, but it seemed like an eternity to them. The executioner raised his axe. The crowd froze. Their lips parted. The axe fell. The thud was dull. Someone in the crowd cried out. The end was quick. First Thomas's face changed, then his body slumped. Eliana felt herself being held tightly, but one tug on the ropes, and she knew Thomas was gone. Her eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't scream. She heard that sound again and again. The executioner moved the body aside and approached her. She looked towards the crowd and met the king's gaze. He stood there, not walking away, not pretending not to see. He said quietly, "It's over." Eliana did not answer. They took her down from the stake and threw her into a separate cell. In the dungeon, she lay on the straw and thought about that kiss. She thought about how warm his lips were, how his voice told her, "I won't leave you." Her body ached from the blows and the ropes, but the pain was far away. She thought about how they just wanted to live. She thought that if the world were different, they could sit by the fire and share bread. Eliana closed her eyes and was silent for a long time. The sound of the falling axe and the voices of the crowd remained in her ears. She knew that no one would come for her. She understood that her life was a story that people would tell in different ways. She thought of Thomas and whispered, "Until the end." The night after the execution passed slowly. Eliana was left alone in the dungeon. In the morning, they brought her plain bread and water. She ate in silence. Her hands still hurt from the ropes. The sound of the axe lingered in her ears and refused to go away. A piece of time stretched into long days. A priest came to see her. He spoke of repentance. "Pray, child, that your soul may find peace," he said, and recited short prayers. She listened and replied briefly, "I pray in my own way." The priest looked at her strangely, but did not argue. Once she asked him directly, "Did you see him before his execution?" He nodded. "Yes. He asked me to pray for you." She clenched her fists. "Did he say anything to me?" The priest closed his eyes and said quietly, "He said it was his duty to die for your escape. He asked that you live, if you can." Eliana said nothing. She thought about the words and their weight. The days passed. They brought her clothes, but did not allow her to go out. Downstairs in the palace, people talked about what had happened. People argued about who was to blame. Some said that the king had done the right thing, while others felt a quiet pity. The executioner went on with his life as if nothing had happened. Thomas was dead, and that seemed to be a fact that could not be changed. Eliana felt that her world had shrunk to 4 walls. One day, an old courtier came to her, the one who used to carry the king's orders. He sat down on a stool and said, "The king asked me to tell you that he wants you to think about your sins." She looked at him and asked, "The king himself?" He took a sip from his cup and replied, "He's not asking right now. He is busy with affairs of state." She was silent and asked, "Then why have you come?" He looked at her and said, "People in the city are talking. The crowd remembers. Some are not happy." She sighed and asked, "What are they saying?" He replied, "They say that Thomas was brave. They say you were brave too. But in this world, bravery is no guarantee of life." Eliana nodded. Her voice was firm. If they remember, let them remember the truth. Several weeks passed. A letter arrived for her. It was brought by the boy who fed the street cleaners. He bowed and said, "It's from the woman who was in the village by the river. She asked me to tell you. I saw Thomas ask a farmer for water before his execution. He smiled and said that it wasn't the end if someone remembered." Eliana read the letter and placed it on her lap. The little piece of paper was a simple fact, but it was a comforting fact. She pressed the letter to her chest. Meanwhile, changes began to take place in the royal court. Senators spoke of security and that the crown should not appear weak. The king, however, increasingly remained in his chambers longer and remained silent at formal receptions. A young lord approached the king and said bluntly, "Father, people are whispering. They say the punishment was too harsh. They say the execution hurts the people's feelings." The king listened and said quietly, "I am doing my duty. An oath cannot give way to pity." The Lord looked down and replied, "But sometimes duty is not only the law, it is also honor." The king was silent. There was no harshness in his voice, but there was something else, a weariness that was not apparent in his words. Meanwhile, Eliana was questioned again. This time, a commission of counselors and monks came. They asked about the accusations, about her connections, about who knew. She replied simply, "I did not betray anyone. I asked for help. Thomas helped. We tried to leave." One of the monks said, "Daughter, tell the truth. For your words, the court may be lenient." She looked at him and said, "What truth do you want to hear? I lived in a castle. I had friends and enemies. Rumors are part of court life. I did not give my honor to someone I did not love. I asked to live." They wrote down her words. But the records did not save her. Some time passed. The king received complaints and saw the faces of people who came to the gates and whispered quietly. His advisors demanded action. The people want order. If she cannot be spared, then let the trial be concluded. The king stood up and said sharply, "The trial has been held. The decision has been made. But if the people start to stir, I will decide." He ordered a council to be convened. At the council, he spoke differently. "We have set an example, but if people look at us with pity and talk about the sanctity of 2 lives, it could undermine confidence in the throne." He paused, then added, "The sentence will be carried out, but I want everything to look fair." His words were cold-blooded. A few days later, the same guard commander who had previously brought the orders entered the prison cell. He looked at Eliana and said, "The king orders you to be brought to the square tomorrow. He wants everything to be clear." She did not answer. Inside, she felt a tightening again, but her voice remained steady. "So be it." He nodded and left. The night before the execution passed as before. The priest came again and said, "Make peace with God." Eliana replied, "I am doing what I can." The priest silently bowed his head and left. She was left alone. Her thoughts returned to Thomas. She remembered how he held her hand in the forest, how he whispered. She thought about what would happen to her next. She did not try to beg for mercy. She knew that her fate would not change because of her pleas. At dawn, they were led out into the square. The people had gathered again. Many stood with their heads bowed. Among the crowd were those who wept. The commander placed her next to the platform. Before her lay Thomas's body, which had been carried out and placed at the foot of the platform. His face was pale and peaceful. She looked at his features and saw the sign he had given her in the forest, a small scar on his chin. She approached him. She did not ask for forgiveness. She touched his lips as she had done before when they were together and said quietly, "I am with you." No one interfered. The crowd fell silent. The commander looked at the king. The king looked away, and no gesture interrupted the moment. Eliana knelt down and pressed her head against his chest. She took his hand, stiff and cold, and kissed it. This kiss was not theater, not an attempt to soften the sentence. It was a final act, a promise. She was lifted up and tied to a stake. She looked up and saw the faces of the people. Some were crying. She saw the king too. He stood motionless. She noticed his hand tremble. She thought, "He sees everything, but he cannot change it." Thomas lay silently beside her. Eliana closed her eyes and thought that, in the minute before the end, it seemed to her that everything that had happened was true. The last word flashed through her mind. To the end. She was led out into the square early in the morning. The crowd was already standing there before the first rays of sunlight. The people stood close together, some whispering, some were silent. The commander of the guard stood nearby and gave orders. Eliana was led by the hand. Her hands were tied. She walked steadily. No one dragged her, but no one helped her either. She saw faces everywhere, familiar and unfamiliar. She stopped when they approached the platform and looked at Thomas's body. It lay on the steps, covered with a coarse cloth. She approached, knelt down, and placed her hand on his chest. The cloth was cold. She pulled it back and ran her fingers over his lips. She kissed him as people kiss for the last time. The kiss was quiet. No one interfered. By that time, the king was standing on the balcony of the throne. He looked down and held a scroll in his hands. His face was stern, but there was something else in his eyes: fatigue and heaviness. One of the courtiers said clearly to him, "Your Majesty, everything is ready." The king nodded, but gave no sign to the crowd. The commander of the guard gestured for everything to be prepared. Eliana was lifted up and tied to a post. The ropes were tight. She felt the wood clinging to her body. Her arms lay motionless at her sides. The crowd fell silent. At that moment, the priest approached her. He placed his hand on her forehead and prayed quietly. Eliana heard the words but did not respond. Her thoughts were focused on Thomas. She closed her eyes and said quietly, "If you are somewhere, remember me." The priest waved his hand as required. He said, "Repent, child. Accept God's will." She nodded and said, "I accept." These were not words of faith. They were the words of a person who no longer wanted to fight the inevitable. A murmur rose from the crowd. Someone shouted the king's name, while others silently averted their eyes. The commander stood before the platform and shouted the sentence. His voice referred to the law. Eliana, daughter of the king, is found guilty of treason. The court sentences her to death. His words were clear. Eliana heard them and did not flinch. She looked up at the balcony. The king was looking straight at her. There was no satisfaction or anger on his face. He just glanced at her and turned away. Before the execution, a woman from the court, who had once been her nanny, rushed to her. She climbed down onto the platform and, without asking, cut part of the ropes so that they would not hold her neck too tightly. She said quietly to Eliana, "I'm sorry, child. I wanted to help, but it's too late." Eliana took her hand and said, "Thank you." The woman cried quietly and left. The executioner approached and raised his axe. His hands were steady. He was a man of his work and was carrying out an order. Eliana looked at the executioner and asked calmly, "Do you know what you're doing?" He replied briskly, "I know." She nodded. "Do it quickly," she said. He nodded again and took a step back. Before it was over, a boy was brought to her with a piece of paper. The boy was trembling, but he held the paper firmly. He said, "This is a letter from Thomas's mother. She asked me to deliver his last words." Eliana took the paper and unfolded it. There were a few lines on the paper. "Tell him I remember his face. Tell him his name is not a disgrace. Tell him I will pray for their souls." Eliana clenched the paper in her fist. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "I hear you." She turned and looked at the crowd. Her gaze was firm. She said loudly, "I am not asking for mercy. I am asking for the truth. If anyone knows who spread lies about me, let them speak. I do not want the memory of us to be false." The people listened. Some froze, some shook their heads. The king heard her request but did not say a word in response. The executioner raised his axe. Eliana took a deep breath, as if gathering all her words and images. She remembered the forest, the bread, that kiss, and the night before her escape. Only one name flashed through her mind: Thomas. She closed her eyes and whispered, "To the end." Then she opened her eyes, looked at the king once more and said, "Goodbye." Her voice trembled, but everyone could hear it. The axe slid down. The sound of the blow was loud. The crowd gasped. Eliana felt a sharp pain and then emptiness. Her last sensation was the warmth of Thomas's kiss on her lips, the memory of his hand clasped in the forest, and the words they had not had time to say. Then everything faded. People stepped back. Some fell to their knees. Some turned away. The commander gave the order to take the body away. The funeral was quick. The bodies were taken to a small chapel at the monastery. A monk conducted a simple ceremony. Thomas was buried first, in the old plot that the peasant knew by the river. Eliana was laid to rest beside him. A small group of people attended the funeral. A few peasants, the woman who had helped cut the ropes, the boy with the letter, and an old courtier. No one spoke loudly. They lowered the earth onto the coffins and left. After the funeral, there was talk in the castle. The lords discussed what to do next. Some said that the example should remain, others that the punishment was too harsh and had undermined confidence in the crown. The king sat in his chambers and appeared less in public. His chambers were filled with papers and affairs, but his voice became less frequent. One night, one of the advisors entered and said, "Your Majesty, the people remember Thomas and Eliana. They whisper about injustice." The king was silent for a long time, then said quietly, "The verdict has been passed. I have fulfilled my duty." The advisor looked at him and said, "But duty is not always the same as justice." The king lowered his eyes and did not answer. Months passed. The story of the princess and her jailer became a topic of conversation. People spoke differently. Some called them traitors, others called them heroes. In taverns and markets, people recounted their last days in that kiss. Small children sang about Thomas as the one who tried to save the princess. In villages, candles were lit at chapels. For some, their names became a symbol of the fact that truth and duty can be in conflict. Years passed. The king died. He lived his last days in solitude. Before his death, he asked that no victories be written on his tomb. He said that ruling was a lesson, and that he should be remembered not for his triumphs, but for the mistakes he had made. When his relatives asked him what he meant, he saw the names of Thomas and Eliana and could not answer. Time did not erase the memory. People remembered. Someone placed a cross on the grave. Someone else placed a simple stone with their names on it. The story of their love and the mistakes of the crown was passed from mouth to mouth. Some added details, others removed them, but everyone agreed on one thing. They left together, even when the world gave them no chance to live. Their actions became part of the lives of those who remained. And somewhere, in those conversations, people learned to look at duty differently, not only as an order, but also as a responsibility to the truth.